You are about to hear a report from Senator Richard Nixon, nominee for the office of Vice President of the United States. The senator has interrupted his nationwide campaign tour to be with you tonight for this important message.
On September 23, 1952, beleaguered vice presidential candidate Richard M. Nixon stared into the lens of a television camera to deliver a speech designed to save his political career.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned.
In just 6 years, Nixon had risen from an obscure California congressman to the vice presidential running mate of war hero Dwight Eisenhower. But when press reports surfaced alleging that Nixon was the beneficiary of a secret fund set up by wealthy contributors, his career was suddenly in jeopardy.
First, the headline was very misleading in three characteristics. The fund was not secret. It was not a rich man's fund. And the purpose of the fund was not to keep me in a style far above what I could afford. As a matter of fact, it was a routine fund, which were very common in the Congress then and even more so today, which took care of political expenses that could not be properly charged to the government.
Instead of coming to Nixon's defense, some of Eisenhower's advisors suggested dropping him from the ticket. Eisenhower himself stood cautiously in the background.
He then told the press in an off-the-record session that there was going to be no attempt here to whitewash Nixon, that he had to come out clean as a hound's tooth.
Now fighting for his political life, Nixon chose to go where no politician had gone before. He turned to television, taking his case directly to the American people. But just as Nixon prepared to give the speech that would make or break his career, he received a startling call from former presidential candidate Thomas E. Dewey.
This call came in from Dewey, and Dewey said, Dick, he said, I don't agree with this, but I said, I think you should know that Eisenhower's advisors have all met. They unanimously agree that you should resign from the ticket. I said, well, it's a little late to hear that. He said, I think probably that's what you should do. And he says, I think further that what you should do is resign from the Senate. And then what you should do is to announce you're going to resign from the Senate and then run for re-election so as you can be vindicated in re-election. It was getting a little unreal at that point because Dewey was a pro, he was a friend and so forth. So I just didn't say a word. Must have been about a 2-minute or at least 1 minute silence. And then Dewey said, well, what are you going to do? I said, Governor, I don't know what I'm going to do. Just tell your friends to listen to the broadcast.
Now, the usual political thing to do when charges are made against you is to either ignore them or to deny them without giving details. I have a theory, too, that the best and only answer to a smear or to an honest misunderstanding of the facts is to tell the truth. And that's why I'm here tonight. I want to tell you my side of the case.
With his wife, Pat, looking on, Nixon presented himself as an honest, hard-working man of modest circumstance.
I don't happen to be a rich man, so I couldn't use that thing. Another way that is used is to put your wife on the payroll. But I have never done that for this reason. I have found that there are so many deserving stenographers and secretaries in Washington that needed the work that I just didn't feel it was right to put my wife on the payroll. My wife's sitting over here, and I can tell you folks that she's worked many hours at night and many hours on Saturdays and Sundays in my office, and she's done a fine job. And I'm proud to say tonight that in the 6 years I've been in the House and the Senate of the United States, Pat Nixon has never been on the government payroll. Just an hour ago, we received an independent audit of this entire fund. I suggested to Governor Sherman Adams, who was the chief of staff of the Dwight Eisenhower campaign, that an independent audit and legal report be obtained. Quote, it is our conclusion that Senator Nixon did not obtain any financial gain from the collection and disbursement of the fund by Dana Smith. that Senator Nixon did not violate any federal or state law by reason of the operation of the fund.
Then came the moment which would forever define Nixon's speech. Borrowing a shrewd tactic from President Franklin Roosevelt, he told a story about the family dog, Checkers.
I knew a little about political history. I remembered that FDR, whom I always admired as a great politician, had really decimated his opponents in one of his campaigns when in Boston he made a speech and he was answering some of the attacks and said these attacks were unfair against him. And then he went on to say, and I suppose next they're going to be attacking my dog, Fala.
We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat in the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
The Checkers speech succeeded. Thousands of telegrams of support poured in, ensuring Nixon's survival. The nascent power of television had saved Richard Nixon's career, and neither television nor presidential politics would ever be the same.
The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency.
Of all the institutions arrayed against a president, Richard Nixon once wrote, none controls his fate more than television. As for why Nixon came to regard television as an adversary, one need look no further than the 1960 election year debate between Nixon and his rival for the presidency, John F. Kennedy. That event was the first of its kind to be broadcast on national television. It permanently altered the political landscape. It changed not only how America selects its leaders, but why.
It was like Miss America. You picked the more attractive of the two men, and that's how Jack Kennedy beat Richard Nixon. He turned out to be the more attractive guy.
At the time, Senator Kennedy was far less familiar to the American public than was Nixon. But on television, his good looks and evident composure provided an excellent calling card.
If we fail to move ahead, if we fail to develop sufficient military and economic and social strength here in this country, then I think that the tide could begin to run against us. And I don't want historians 10 years from now to say, these were the years when the tide ran out for the United States. I want them to say, these were the years when the tide came in. These were the years when the United States started to move again.
Up to that point, he was this good-looking guy from Massachusetts. He looked like a Harvard undergrad. You know, he was well-tailored, he was handsome, he was glamorous. I think, in hindsight, Nixon must have said to himself, why did I do that? I mean, why did I give this guy the exposure? I mean, I was his press agent. Jack Kennedy making speeches is a bore. Jack Kennedy debating Richard Nixon is an event.
Kennedy arrived at the TV studios in Chicago on the afternoon of September 26th, looking tanned and well-rested.
He wanted to know, where do I stand? How long do I have to answer? Will I get a warning when I've gone too far? I mean, he really wanted to know the nuts and bolts of what we were going to do. Jack Kennedy knew that an election could ride on this television appearance. Nixon thought it was just another campaign appearance.
The main thing missing from the great debate was a debate.
I think if the United States is maintaining a strong society here in the United States, I think that we can meet any internal threat. The major threat is external and will continue.
Mr. Nixon, comment?
I agree with Senator Kennedy's appraisal generally in this respect. The question of communism within the United States has been one that has worried us in the past. It is one that will continue to be a problem for years to come.
People who watched it on television thought Kennedy won. People who heard on radio thought Nixon won.
But their first televised encounter remains significant for another reason. It was the night when political campaigners and television executives came together and discovered that they were made for each other.
In the middle of this thing, the politicians are looking at the television executives and figured, those guys have a reach in everybody's living room. The television guys are looking at the politicians and saying, they're a source of unlimited advertising dollars. That's a bottomless pit. That night changed the face of American politics. That was the night that television and politics eyed each other, flirted with each other, got engaged, and eventually got married. And because of that, you cannot hold office in the United States of America or even think about running for office unless you've got the money to buy television time. Politics in America is now a money game, and it all weaned off the night of the first television debate.
70 million Americans, at the time the largest political audience in U.S. history, watched the first televised debate. In November 1960, Kennedy defeated Nixon in one of the closest presidential elections in history, and many believed that the debates had made the difference.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
John F. Kennedy was not the first president to appear on television, but he was America's first television president.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
The televised image of this youthful, articulate leader seemed to reflect a nation's yearning for a fresher, brighter day. On November 22nd, 1963, it came to a sudden end. President Kennedy arrived in Dallas that morning for a political goodwill visit. Citizens lined the streets, waving as the presidential motorcade moved slowly through the city. At about 12:30, as the open convertible carrying the presidential party passed through Dealey Plaza, 3 sharp cracks punctuated the afternoon air.
When that news broke, I immediately called Frank Stanton, who was president of CBS. He was in a very important meeting. And his secretary said, I'm sorry he's not to be disturbed. I said, you better disturb him. She said, well, I'm not allowed to disturb him. I said, the president's just been shot. She said, well, he'll call you back. I said, he better call me back immediately because he may not be alive by the time he calls me back. Stanton called back and he said, get on the air and hold the air and don't put anything else on until we find out whether he's dead or alive.
As details trickled in, I began reporting that day's shocking events.
Throughout the streets of Dallas, the Dallas police had been augmented by some 400 policemen called in on their day off because there were some fears and concerns in Dallas.
It was just the beginning of what would become 4 days of uninterrupted and unprecedented news coverage.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
I thought he was going to lose it, but he didn't. I figured, uh-oh, where's Severide? I got to get somebody in there right away. Because I didn't know whether Waller was going to recover from it, but pro that he is, he did. But I think that moment, all of America shared that. They all felt what he felt. They felt the same despair, the same, my God, what do we do now? And I think there was probably a tear in 100 million eyes, as there was in Waller's.
Within minutes of Kennedy's death, Lyndon Baines Johnson took the oath of office aboard Air Force One. Arriving in Washington that evening, he made his first address as president.
I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
2 days later came the spectacle of another shocking murder, this time live on television. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of shooting the president, was being transferred from a holding cell in the basement of the city jail. Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby approached Oswald and shot him at point-blank range.
Oswald has been shot.
Lee Oswald.
Oswald has been shot.
The
The situation is now, well, Oswald has been shot. The man who saw the shot fired said it was fired by a man wearing a black hat, a brown coat, a man that everyone down here thought was a Secret Service agent.
Sometimes television is a theater. Sometimes it's a newsroom. Sometimes it's a chapel. All of America came to their television sets, and in effect, not actually, but in effect, all of America held hands. That is the best use of television.
Kennedy's coffin lay in state at the nation's capital that day as thousands of mourners gathered to pay their final respects. The next day, television followed the funeral procession to Arlington National Cemetery, where John F. Kennedy, age 47, was laid to rest. The Vietnam War may have been fought halfway around the globe, but television brought it into our living rooms. As the casualties from that conflict grew, so did America's uncertainty about the mission, and television showed that too.
You almost have an obligation to say that there were a lot of American kids being killed in the jungles of Vietnam. And why? There was a thing called the 5 o'clock follies. USIA used to have a briefing on the casualties each day. We all knew they made it up. I mean, there was no question, because all of us have been around there. And somebody had to point out, maybe we didn't belong there.
In early 1968, I traveled again to Vietnam to see the war for myself. I concluded then that our presence there was neither noble nor practical.
Who won and who lost in the Great Tet Offensive against the cities? I'm not sure. The Viet Cong did not win by a knockout, but neither did we, and the referees of history may make it a draw. This summer's almost certain standoff will either end in real give and take negotiations or terrible escalation. And for every means we have to escalate, the enemy can match us, and that applies to invasion of the North, the use of nuclear weapons, or the mere commitment of 100 or 200 or 300,000 more American troops to the battle. And with each escalation, the world comes closer to the brink of cosmic disaster. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
Walter went to Vietnam and came to the conclusion that it was the wrong war in the wrong place, and came back and said so. George Reedy, who was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, told me that when Johnson heard Walter say that, he said to George, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the American people.
5 weeks later, on March 31st, President Lyndon Johnson delivered a nationally televised address on the state of the war. He concluded with a stunning announcement.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Vietnam showed what an emotionally explosive combination television and war could be, and the U.S. government took notice. The media would be far more restricted in their movements when reporting future conflicts, adding freedom of information to the list of wartime casualties.
What was once the furthest outpost on the old frontier of the West will be the furthest outpost on the new frontier of science and space.
When President Kennedy took office in 1961, he titled his agenda The New Frontier, and exploring outer space became its most exhilarating challenge.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Television was uniquely well suited to this daring enterprise. When John Glenn orbited the Earth in 1962, it demonstrated how the space race had captured the imagination of the country.
I figured, I'm going to put a big screen in Grand Central Station. We'll attract a crowd, and a guy at home will realize, hey, there are other people as interested in this as I am, and I'm part of a national outpouring. And that's the real value of this thing, is this shared experience.
When Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon in 1969, more than 1 billion people around the globe bore witness to that journey.
Man on the moon.
We copy you down, Eagle. Houston,
Oh, jeez.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
I have to admit that I was awestruck as I watched Armstrong take one giant leap for mankind.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Television recorded those steps with its first lunar broadcast, and Armstrong's crew returned to a world transfixed and transformed by what they'd seen. But space exploration remained a hazardous endeavor that risked tragedy as well as triumph. But the public grew complacent about the space program's achievements and its dangers. To help revive interest, NASA selected a high school teacher named Krista McAuliffe to be America's first civilian astronaut.
America's first teacher in space has become one of the most talked about missions in the shuttle program.
There was no question that this launch had taken on a whole different aura. This was a true civilian going into space, and it was Krista McAuliffe, and she was full of energy and life.
But TV networks were losing interest in the space program as well. Despite McAuliffe's presence aboard the Challenger, only CNN provided live coverage of the launch.
Steve Sonnenblick, my cameraman, and the sound tech were up on a mound, which was kind of a photo mound, and he was shooting the launch off of that.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning, it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
All of a sudden, there was this big cloud that kind of engulfed the spaceship. People began to realize, well, something's wrong here, because the vehicle never came out from behind the cloud. And I said, Steve, I said, what the hell happened? He looks at me and he says, the thing blew up.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace that special spirit that says, give me a challenge and I'll meet it with joy. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue.
Television and the space program discovered that they were made for each other. Two visionary enterprises became linked by their mission, sharing unforgettable moments of tragedy and triumph. When President Nixon ran for re-election in 1972, his popularity was never higher. The most famous Cold Warrior of his era had earned acclaim for his diplomatic breakthroughs with China and the Soviet Union. Despite bitter controversy over his handling of the war in Vietnam, the polls showed Nixon easily defeating his Democratic challenger. But Nixon's political skills were no match for his paranoia. In hopes of gaining an upper hand, Nixon's underlings hatched a scheme to burglarize the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in June of 1972. When the burglars were arrested, Nixon approved a cover-up, which slowly but surely came unraveled.
Watergate, Senate hearings. To ensure complete live nationwide coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings, the three commercial television networks are rotating the daily coverage.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
By the spring of 1974, the Watergate affair was a full-blown scandal, as televised congressional hearings gradually uncovered the cover-up.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of the installation of any devices on any of the telephones, first of all, the Oval Office?
Yes, sir.
Now, the tapes which you mentioned, which are stored, are they stored by particular date?
Yes, sir, they are.
And so that if either Mr. Dean, Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Ehrlichman, Mr. Colson had particular meetings in the Oval Office with the President on any particular dates that have been testified before this committee, there would be a tape recording with the President of that full conversation, would there not?
Yes, sir.
Nixon claimed that the tapes were designed to secure his place in history. Instead, they sealed his fate. On August 8, 1974, Nixon delivered his farewell address to the nation.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The next morning, Nixon made a final White House appearance.
Steve Bull came up to brief us on the entrance into the grand ballroom, where we were to say goodbye to the official administration people, the cabinet and all the other top people in administration, about 300 of them. And then he said, now the 3 television cameras will be here. And Mrs. Nixon said, "Not on your life." She said, "After what they have done to us, I am not going to let them interfere in this last private meeting with our friends." Well, I had to disagree, and I said, "No, we have to do it. We've got to do it for our friends. We've got to do it for the country."
Then at noon, August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon boarded a helicopter to make history one last time as the only U.S. president to resign his office. Back in 1952, Richard Nixon's checker speech harnessed the power of television to save his career. 22 years later, television was there to chronicle his political self-destruction.
Diana Francis, wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband, to live together according to God's law in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love him, comfort him, honor and keep him in sickness and in health, and forsaking all other, keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live?
I will.
Once upon a time, she was Lady Diana Spencer, a woman transformed into a fairy tale princess in the television age. Diana was an attractive young woman who worked as a kindergarten teacher, and then she met England's Prince Charles and became a royal celebrity. Their lavish wedding in 1981 was broadcast around the globe to an audience of almost 1 billion.
I pronounce that they be man and wife together, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
But as years went by, the ceaseless flow of news and gossip revealed that Princess Di was not living happily ever after. Her marriage to Prince Charles fell apart. 4 years later, their divorce became final. Though technically no longer royalty, Diana still lived in a golden fishbowl. Cameras chronicled her every move and misstep. On August 30th, 1997, paparazzi were staking out the Paris hotel where Diana was dining with her boyfriend, Egyptian businessman Dodi Fayed. Shortly before midnight, they ducked into a waiting sedan along with a bodyguard and a driver.
Just into CNN, apparently Princess Diana has been in a serious road accident in Paris. The wire services right now, the Reuters news agency as well as Agence France-Presse, are both saying that she has been seriously injured.
Rescue crews worked desperately to pry Diana from the wreckage. The paparazzi snapped pictures.
We are just getting word that the French government has informed all of us that Princess Diana has died.
Let me say again how very sad Hillary and I are about the terrible accident that has taken the life of Princess Diana and the others who were with her. We liked her very much. We admired her work for children, for people with AIDS, for the cause of ending the scourge of landmines in the world, and for her love for her children, William and Harry.
She was a wonderful and warm human being. Though her own life was often sadly touched by tragedy, she touched the lives of so many others in Britain, throughout the world, with joy and with comfort.
The Queen, who bows to no one, bowed before the coffin of her former daughter-in-law. A few days ago, such a thing would have been unthinkable.
Princess Diana's funeral took place on Saturday, September 6th at London's Westminster Abbey, a ceremony whose elaborate presentation and global coverage bore an eerie resemblance to her wedding 16 years before.
We are gathered here in Westminster Abbey to give thanks for the life of Diana, Princess of Wales, to commend her soul to Almighty God, and to seek his comfort for all who mourn.
Once more, thousands lined the streets as 1 billion viewers around the globe looked on. Diana Spencer, the people's princess, died as she lived, with the whole world watching. When it comes to TV news, the most memorable stories are usually those that record the march of world events. But on October 14th, 1987, Millions of viewers bore witness to the plight of a tiny child hovering between life and death, a little girl in Midland, Texas, known as Baby Jessica.
Jessica McClure was about 18 months old. She was playing in the backyard of her aunt. She fell into an old abandoned well. The well was about 8 inches in diameter, then narrowed to about 6 inches.
There was no way to pull Jessica out. As the news spread, TV crews joined rescue teams for a round-the-clock vigil.
Everyone was gathered in the neighbor's backyard and looking over a fence. As soon as the crew and I got there, we went knocking on doors to get a ladder, just to be able to see over the fence, to be able to shoot video of the rescue effort.
The rescuers are making progress literally by inches, and at that rate, it may be some time before young Jessica is brought to the surface.
With time ticking, rescuers began drilling into the ground beside the well, working to the point of exhaustion.
Midland is an oil town. This is a town that knows about drilling wells and has the personnel and the equipment. They drilled a second shaft parallel to the well that she was in.
TV's constant coverage brought in help far from Midland.
There were offers from people and companies all around the country, different suggestions of how to get her out. One of them came from a company in Tennessee. They had a kind of a high-powered water drill that used water under high pressure, and that was flown in on Friday. And that's the thing that really turned the tide.
For 2 days, rescuers worked frantically while friends and family stood by.
You've been anxious, we've been anxious. The eyes, the hearts, the minds of people around the world have been on Jessica McClure underground in Midland, Texas.
We're told that 2 paramedics are now down in the shaft, and if that is the case, then it may be just a matter of time now before they are able to pull young Jessica McClure, the 18-month-old, out of this hole that she's been in more than 52 hours now.
On the evening of October 16th, 58 hours after her ordeal began, Jessica McClure was brought to safety.
The president's back in the White House, and he no doubt is tuning in now to watch this drama unfold.
This isn't just an event in Midland, Texas. This is something that pulls on the heartstrings of people around the world.
It looks like they're bringing her up right now. We're seeing a lot of activity. The ropes are being pulled up.
The producer in Atlanta, he wanted me to describe what was happening up until the point where it was obvious that she was coming out of the well. You can see the cable coming up. Everyone's eyes are looking down. And then the instruction was simply be quiet. Let the pictures and the emotions tell the story.
We've been on a roller coaster of emotion, and this is certainly the high point.
The rescue of baby Jessica may not have altered the course of history, but her drama displayed television's ability to join Americans, from the President of the United States to the man in the street, in a common crucible of hope and humanity. For almost 3 decades, the Berlin Wall forcibly separated East and West, communism and capitalism, dictatorship and democracy. Topped by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers, it was once the ultimate emblem of a people divided against themselves. It was erected by the East German government in August of 1961 to staunch the flow of refugees from East to West Berlin. The wall's construction underscored the intractable Cold War barriers between the world's 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
Beginning with John F. Kennedy's memorable trip to Berlin in June of 1963, Western leaders employed the wall as a symbol of struggle against Soviet-sponsored tyranny.
As long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind.
Even as that nation began to soften its hardline policies in the 1980s, President Reagan went to the wall to issue a pointed challenge to then Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev.
We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
This just into the newsroom. Associated Press is reporting that East Germany has thrown all of its borders open to its citizens to travel anywhere they wish. There is nothing yet to indicate whether that will have any effect on the Berlin Wall, whether it will be torn down, or that major border crossing point be open to free travel as well.
There are thousands of people here in front of the wall at the Brandenburg Gate at this hour. The West Berlin police are keeping the crowd away from the wall. East German border guards have a little more than a token presence, but not much more than that. Yesterday they had been lined up shoulder to shoulder atop the wall, but now the West Berlin police have apparently agreed to keep the crowd away. But the sense of excitement is undeniable.
But when the wall finally fell, it was the ordinary citizens of Berlin who did the job. In November of 1989, the East German government agreed to reopen the borders of the city. In the jubilant scene that followed, Berliners from east and west climbed to the top of the wall to celebrate, while others used hammers and chisels to chip away at the once indomitable fortress. And television was there to chronicle the wall coming down.
Well, I don't think any single event is the end of what you might call the Iron Curtain. But clearly, this is a long way from the harshest Iron Curtain days, a long way from that.
The collapse of the Berlin Wall foreshadowed the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. The Cold War is over. The wall itself has crumbled. Its shards have turned into souvenirs. But images of the wall, its rise and fall, remain the defining symbol of a conflict which shaped world events throughout the second half of the 20th century. For almost 2 decades, O.J. Simpson enthralled sports fans by evading his pursuers on the football field. But none of those broken field runs captivated TV viewers more than O.J.'s flight from the law on June 17, 1994. The Simpson saga began 4 nights earlier when Nicole Brown Simpson and her companion, Ronald Goldman, were found murdered outside her home. After police identified Simpson as a prime suspect, he agreed to turn himself in.
When we heard that he was turning himself in, we decided to go down to Parker Center and get some video of him turning himself in.
And then we waited and waited and waited, and finally a police spokesman came outside and said,
"The Los Angeles Police Department right now is actively searching for Mr. Simpson."
We wanted to find O.J. And so we decided we weren't going to stand with the other 1,000 reporters and camera crews and technicians all waiting for O.J. to give himself up or wait for the next word from the police department. We were going to find him.
The Turs took to the air and the airwaves. As they flew over Nicole's gravesite, the Turs picked up a sheriff's department broadcast that suggested that O.J. was using a cell phone in their vicinity.
Bob Tur, we're over the 5 freeway, past the 55 freeway. O.J. Simpson is believed to be in the white Bronco that you see in the center of your picture, followed by as many as 9 Orange County Sheriff's deputies.
The Turs had found their man, and seconds later, millions around the world were watching the strangest, slowest car chase in history.
With a flip of the switch, literally, we were on the air. The signal was beamed back on satellite back to New York. It was rerouted through the CBS system. So everyone CBS across the country was now getting this feed. And that slow, infamous speed pursuit was now being broadcast to more people in the world than any other news event at that time. This was like live cops and robbers stuff coming out of Los Angeles, and people were fascinated by it.
For a short time, the Turs had their TV scoop all to themselves. But as the police closed in on O.J., the media closed in too.
After about 40 minutes, we were joined by another 15 news helicopters. And I mean, everybody that had a credit card and a camera would rent a helicopter, jump aboard, and become part of this fray. So when it finally ended in Brentwood, there were about, I think, 21 helicopters was the last count, 21 helicopters hovering over this one house. So as you looked out your window, there were helicopters above you, below you, to your side. It was just insane.
The surreal chase of O.J. Simpson was just the opening chapter in what would become the most media-saturated murder trial in American history. When jurors announced their verdict in the case on October 3, 1995, the nation tuned in.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information.
But despite the verdict, the controversy over Simpson's culpability in the murder of his wife and her friend, Ronald Goldman, has yet to settle. And for many, the image of O.J. Simpson, football hero, will be forever shadowed by that of a man fleeing the law before an audience of millions. It was the election that did not decide the presidency and became the biggest media debacle since Dewey defeats Truman.
Election night 2000 was the biggest political story I had ever covered, the biggest story I'd ever covered.
The 2000 campaign between presidential candidates George W. Bush and Al Gore was shaping up as a cliffhanger.
What's the key element we should be watching for throughout the day tomorrow?
Florida, Florida, Florida. I honestly believe, Matt, as goes Florida, will go the nation. And I said that because I thought the state of Florida had changed significantly over the last several presidential election cycles. It had voted Democratic, then it switched to Republican, and now I thought the changing demographics in the state were almost a microcosm of the rest of the country.
As millions of Americans headed to the polls on Election Day 2000, TV networks conducted their own exit polls to get a jump on picking the winner.
What we have found over the previous presidential elections is that the computer models are generally right. In fact, almost always right. But when they're wrong, they are very wrong.
By 8 o'clock that evening, the networks had unanimously predicted that Florida was going for Gore.
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column. This is a state both campaigns desperately wanted to win.
But as the official votes from Florida trickled in, the networks began to realize the gravity of their mistake.
Well, the one thing that we have been right on about Florida tonight is that we said it would be a pivotal state. We said that from the beginning. We were awarding it to Gore. Now we pulled it back, saying it's too close to call.
Florida was up for grabs, and as far as the networks were concerned, it stayed that way until 2:30 the next morning.
It was in the wee hours of the morning that we were told in our earpieces again that a projection was imminent.
George Bush is the president-elect of the United States. He has won the state of Florida, according to our projections.
And we heard the music and the fanfare and the spinning graphics. And then we got more phone calls saying, it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter. I remember one specific moment when someone said in Tom Brokaw's earpiece, and he was seated to my left, and he wrote down 250, and he picked up a piece of paper, and it dropped like a feather. And he said, oh my God, it's down to 251 votes.
With Bush's lead in Florida dropping to a few hundred votes, they began to hedge their declarations of victory again.
We have never seen anything like this before. Florida has gone from too close to call to Gore, to too close to call to Bush, to too close to call. This is truly amazing.
An automatic recount takes place in Florida now. How long that would take, we have no idea.
For 26 days, Bush and Gore partisans fought it out in the courts of law and public opinion, while the nation received a crash course in constitutional law.
For me, the most lasting memory of the election of 2000 was the final weekend leading up to the ultimate decision. And that was on a Friday afternoon. The Florida Supreme Court said, there's going to be a recount. Start counting. And Democrats and Republicans, Gore supporters, Bush supporters, fervent, passionate, angry, obeyed the court and began the recount.
The decisive moment finally arrived on December 12th when the U.S. Supreme Court voted 5-4 to block further recounts and let the official Florida tally stand, handing the state and the presidency to George W. Bush.
And Democrats, Republicans, Gore supporters, Bush supporters dropped their pens and stopped counting. No matter how angry they were, the rule of law prevailed.
While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will to the best of my ability.
And will to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
So ended television's longest and most thoroughly unpredictable coverage of any election in modern history.
Part of me says I hope we never go through another one, but there's still enough journalist in me that says I'd love to do it again.
Tuesday, and security, peace and war were now inextricably woven into the fabric of everyday life.